Hey, everybody, it's Abdu and we're here with Deliberations Live. So great to have you on. A number of you have already logged in. Joining us. We're going to be taking your questions live now. As you know, Deliberations is basically a time when we try to discuss the previous week's episode of All Rise, which is the podcast that Derek Caldwell and I record. Actually, I've been recording them, but one thing that I wanted to preview for you guys is that we've been recording more and more where Derek and I have been interacting. If you're a fan of All Rise or if you're a follower of All Rise, you'll know that most of the time it's just me talking in reaction to a video we play. And last week's episode was no exception to it, but we've been in studio, Derek and I, recording a series of episodes that are going to come out soon. We're just interacting, he and I, on the material, on the objections. We'll be talking about Paula Fredrickson. We'll be talking about Dr. Bart Ehrman. We'll be talking about Ricky Gervais and some issues that he raises and some often raised objections to the Christian faith. So it's going to be fun. And Derek and I have a lot of fun together. Normally, Derek's here with me for Deliberations. You'll notice he is conspicuous by his absence. However, Derek is on a much deserved and much needed time away in vacation. So please do consider Derek and his wife Rachel in your prayers as they experience some good time away from the hustle and bustle of ministry life. But I'm still here, and joining me today, by the way, is Lance Koch, who is our producer. Lance, I don't know if you can show yours. There he is.
There we are.
Lance is on with me, and he'll be interacting to the extent that he can and chooses to do so. Hey, we got from Nigeria, and I need to put this is going to be embarrassing, guys. I might get my readers out because some of the text is too small for me to read, and I don't want to mess up this name that is from Nigeria. I think it's Philibus. Like syllabus, like an academic thing. Okay, look, I just did it. I just shamed myself in front of everybody. Philibus from Nigeria. Hey, thanks for joining us and thanks for being a part of Deliberations. Well, as like I said before, we typically start to talk about the previous week's episode. And the episode from last week was based on one of my favorite movies of all time. In fact, the movie that inspired me to be an attorney, A Few Good Men. Now, I say that with a little bit of tongue planted firmly in cheek because A Few Good Men, while a great lawyer movie, isn't the most realistic lawyer movie in the whole world in terms of how lawyers interact with juries and judges and these kind of things. But I got to tell you, if you watched an actual trial outside of like the sensational of like the OJ trial or something like that, you're going to be pretty bored because they're not nearly as fun as Hollywood makes them look. Although if you're a lawyer, it can be quite good fun in terms of, the hustle and bustle and the action and the intellectual rigor that it takes to maintain focus for that long in a trial. But the quintessential line from A Few Good Men is, of course, delivered by the inimitable Jack Nicholson, where he says, "You can't handle the truth." And this comes after Tom Cruise's character, Daniel Kaffee, thunders away at him for a while and says, "I want the truth," because he was asked, "Do you want answers?" He says, "No, I want the truth." And then he says, "You can't handle the truth." And so the episode was about whether or not we can, in fact, handle the truth when it's presented to us. And I think that this is an important thing because oftentimes, friends, we don't get the answers we're looking for, but we get the answers we need. And sometimes we shy away from the answers we need because they're not the answers that are comfortable for us. And I certainly was among those people for the longest time. We have to guard, by the way, no matter how much we've gone through, the costs of truth and the consequences of truth, and even given our lives in service of the truth. Sometimes the truth in our lives, even once we've committed to embracing the truth, no matter the cost, that's why we're called the ministry we're called, we have to guard ourselves. Are we still having that kind of attitude toward the truth? So anyway, that's where, yes.
I'm going to try to log you on to Instagram one more time. So while you're talking, just if it asks for an approval there, go ahead and give me that.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So did they hear you on that one, Lance? Did they know what we're doing that?
I think they have me on there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're trying to log into the Instagram because the folks who we get some people who do join us on Instagram. And so I am going to be on the lookout for it. If I look down at my phone, I promise you I am not playing. Oh, there's a device login. I'm going to approve that. So there we go. I promise you, I'm not playing Candy Crush. I'm trying to look for the messages that come through here. Anyway, we got a number of people who have already logged in, and so we got some questions coming in. And Gregory Jordan Stewart, we see you. Thanks so much for logging in, and we'd love to address your question. So Greg says, looking forward to another great video. I think I'm obsessed with this series because my mom tells me I talk about Abdu too much. All good things, I promise. Well, thank you very much for that. It is possible to talk about me too much. However, we'll be happily talking about the truth and the message. So hopefully, if you're talking about what we're doing, it's about how we address the truth. Let's talk a little bit more in terms of. I see Tim Ryder also. You've chimed in and asked first of all, you've commented on my message at Rock Point, a community church, Rock Point Community Church in Sterling Heights. There's some good friends of ours. It's a wonderful privilege. I get to speak all over the world, but I also get the privilege of speaking just down the road from where I live, and where my own home church, which is not Rock Point, but Rock Point feels like a second church to me because of the tremendous blessing and response and sense of community that I get from those folks at Rock Point. So thanks again. And so thanks for the encouraging words, Tim. Lance, you're asking me to do the approval thing again. I just don't see it. So let's see.
How about a code? Is it giving you a code? It might send you a code.
Here we go. I think I can approve this. I think I just did it. Okay. So anyway, let's get to some questions. How about that? So let's see. Tim, you asked a question, and I'm trying to find it here in the comments in the section here. You're asking for it again. Okay. All right. I approved it again.
You're doing great. Thanks.
Oh, Lance is very, very impressed with my abilities to approve things. All right. Let me get to this. Let me address Carol's question first, then, as I look for your question, Tim. So stay on. Do not go anywhere. Carol says, truth is defined as the quality or state of being true. Also, that of which is true or in accordance with facts or reality. What do you say to people who say that's my truth? This is fascinating you bring this up, Carol, because I was having a meeting earlier today with a pastor and some leaders in a church about what's going on in the culture right now in terms of postmodernism. And maybe you've heard me speak on this before. I don't think we're actually in a postmodern culture anymore. If you read my book, Saving Truth, you'll know that what I actually think we're in is not a postmodern culture. We're in a post-truth culture, and there's a fundamental and but subtle difference. So postmodernism is the idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, that everything is basically a matter of perspective. There's a long history to why that is, and I won't go into the details of that just yet unless someone asks me to go into the details. But postmodernism was the idea that truth is all subjective essentially anyway, and we come to things with our various perspectives. And so instead of trying to convince someone that what you have is the truth, what you should do is just simply engage in a conversation with people and have an exchange of ideas and create a sort of a Hegelian dialectic, and these kind of things where you come to a sort of an understanding that different perspectives can be equally valid, even if they are contradictory to each other. But of course, that died a death, I think, with probably, I would say, in the late 90s to the early 2000s, it started to die its death because it's filled with a fundamental flaw. And that fundamental flaw is the idea that there is no such thing as objective truth. Why that's a fundamental flaw is because the statement, there are no objective truths, has to be objectively true in order for you to believe it. And so if there are objective truths, then the statement is false. And if there are no objective truths, then the statement that there are no objective truths is false, and therefore is only subjectively true, which in case, why would you believe it? So you can see how the postmodern view essentially, at its essence, sort of dies under its own weight, or it's a postmodernist would saw off the branch upon which they sit. Now, what rose up from that was not sort of a love of truth, as it were, but it's more of a postmodernism 2.0, which is really what post-truth actually is. So post-truth is not the belief that truth doesn't objectively exist. Post-truth, which was the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year in 2016, which was not coined in 2016, it was just used so often that it became the word of the year in 2016. Post-truth is a culture is post-truth when appeals to feelings and preferences are more persuasive than appeals to facts and truth. So what that means is that people who are post-truth, they don't believe that truth doesn't exist. They simply don't care what the truth might be if it happens to conflict with their feelings and their preferences. And everyone, I don't care what worldview you come from, everyone is susceptible to this idea that your feelings and your preferences are going to matter more than the facts and the truth. In fact, that's the point of the episode we aired last week, was that you're post-truth. I was post-truth. Even though I believed in objective truths, I resisted the gospel. I resisted the evidence for the gospel because it didn't fit my preference. It didn't fit the comfort I was looking for. Rather, it was a hard case of what one person said is reality. Reality is, pain. Pain is what reality feels like when it bumps into you. And sometimes truth can be painful. And so I was post-truth, and I have to admit that. Even though I believed that truth existed, I preferred something that was more comforting than the actual truth. Now, the irony, of course, is that now that I believe that I have actually embraced the truth of the Christian message, I find tremendous amounts of comfort in it because it's actually true. It's not just pie in the sky, hope for truth. So this gets down to the nub of the question then. What do we say to people who say, this is my truth, or that's my truth? We have to be careful. We have to ask this question, a follow-up question. What do they mean? Sometimes you can ask it of yourself, like, what do I think they mean? Or you can ask it of the person who's saying the statement, I'm telling you my truth. What do they mean? And this is important because oftentimes the first thing we want to react with, if you're a Christian, if you are a believer in objective truth of any stripe for that matter, whether you're a Christian or not, the first thing you want to do is you bristle. Oh, I want to tell you my truth, because you're like, oh, no, there's no such thing as your truth. There's only the truth. And your truth is, there's no such thing as that. If the person is trying to tell you, I'm telling you my perspective. So I'll give you an example. Let's say someone has gone through a terrible experience. Maybe there's a terrible experience of some kind of emotional abuse or physical, or they have wrestled with deep questions only to have their questions shunned. Or let's say they wrestle with an unbiblical sexual attraction, or they wrestle with some secret sin and they haven't received any grace, care, or attempt at restoration, only judgment. Let's say that's happened. And they want to say, well, I want to tell you what my truth is when it comes to this. They're not saying, or they might not be saying, I'm telling you my truth is that I've claimed a different interpretation of truth, and therefore you have to listen to what I say because truth is what I say it is. They're not saying that. What they're saying is, I want to offer you my perspective, or they're saying, I want to offer you the truth of what happened to me. So in a very real sense, what happened to them is their truth. Let's say someone's experienced terrible racism or sexism, and they've experienced this for years, and they want to tell you their truth. What they're saying is, I'm trying to tell you the truth of my experience. And that doesn't mean it's false. It's objectively true that they went through that. So they're not saying, I'm a relativist. What they're saying is, I've experienced something that perhaps you haven't experienced, and I'd like to give you the truth about what it feels like to go through that. Okay, so that's one. We ought not to just jump on someone because their wording or their rhetoric sort of scratches our ears and doesn't really fit in terms of our terms of objective truth. So if they're telling you their experience and the truth of what they went through, is perfectly valid, and you should listen and engage in the heart of compassion. However, If you find out what they're saying is, I'm telling you my truth, in other words, I define reality the way I see fit, or I define my own identity the way I see fit, and even that if it happens to fly in the face of science or facts or other ways we can verify reality, um, you're not required to accept that truth as the truth. That's when we have to talk about objective truth and whether or not we're trying to conform the truth to our feelings, or we're trying to conform our feelings to the truth. So I hope that's a helpful distinction. When someone says my truth, maybe they're referring to the truth of my experience, in which case that's something we ought to pay attention to and listen with intentionality and compassion and understanding. If they're trying to say my truth, meaning that I believe there is no God, and that truth is just as valid as your truth, which says that there is a God, that's a different story. That's relativism. And we can respond by saying something to the effect of, if you're saying that your truth flies in the face of what I think is actually true, but then my truth contradicts yours, well, then how do we determine who's right? Follow up with the question, how do we determine who's right or wrong in this? Because if your truth is completely subjective and my truth is completely subjective, it all starts to break down. We don't build rocket ships that way. I would never want to walk in and be in my preoperative stage when I'm getting ready for a surgery, and have the surgeon walk in and say, well, my truth is that you have an infected gallbladder and we're going to be taking that out. And my truth is that we'll be using a laparoscopic procedure. And my truth is that you should come out of this just fine. And I happen to say, hey, my truth is I came in here because I have kidney stones. What are you doing? That's a different story, right? So we have to make sure that we're responding to the right thing. To the right intent behind words. Words are sometimes expressed with different intentions or different understandings between the person who's saying them and the person who's hearing them. So a good question will keep us from having to misunderstand each other and talk past each other. So great questions. As my friend Greg Kokel always says, you can ask 2 questions to stay in control of a conversation, not in a manipulative way, but so that you know what's going on. What do you mean, and how do you know? What do you mean gives you information? How do you know gives you information? Pay attention to those 2 things, and you should be in good stead. So let's see. Let's look for another question that's submitted here. Let's see. Here it is. How do you address the potential for confirmation bias in religious belief? Given that confirmation bias is a well-documented cognitive bias, how can one be confident that religious beliefs are not influenced by this bias? Okay, great question. And I think that there is an important answer here. By the way, I have to say, and I was just told this, that someone had submitted that because they asked Chat GPT. This is fascinating because I have a whole talk on AI. They ask Abdu Murray a question essentially about religious belief. And this is the question that Chat GPT spit out. Now, do I think that Chat GPT actually wants to know the answer? Of course not. The person who used Chat GPT wants the answer. And so it's not that the machines are thinking for us. It's that it just simply scraped stuff from the internet, just cobbled together the things that I tend to address, and asking me and ask me questions that I tend to address. And I, because of this episode that we just listened to or just watched, it was aired last week, talk about confirmation bias. So I think confirmation bias is a real thing in religious belief. I think confirmation bias is a real thing in every mode of trying to understand and believe in reality. What I mean by that is this. So first of all, let's define confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the phenomenon that every human being is subjected to, where if you look at a piece of evidence and you have a certain bent to you, so maybe you're pro death penalty, and maybe another person looks at the exact same piece of evidence about whether or not the death penalty is good or bad, and they look at that same exact evidence and they're anti-death penalty, they would view it in a way that helps their case. And you would view it in a way that helps your case. So confirmation bias is where 2 people who hold different views on something will actually look at the same exact piece of information and think it helps them, or they want a certain outcome to be true. And so they look at the evidence, they stack it up so that they can actually come to the conclusion they already wanted in the first place. Researchers talk about this stuff all the time. Now, for certain research, whether it's scientific research in terms of biology or psychological, social science research, whatever it is, you try to build into the protocols for your inquiry, your investigation, your experiment, ways to get rid of confirmation bias. And there's control groups, there's statistical things you can do, there's double-blind tests, there's ways in which you get other people involved in the search or in the investigation so that they can challenge each other in terms of their biases, because this exists in all walks of life. In religious inquiry, it's the same thing. So one of the confirmation biases we have is that we tend to think that the tradition into which we are born is the correct one. And I don't care if that's religious or non-religious. Atheists and Christians all have confirmation bias. Muslims have confirmation bias. Hindus will have confirmation bias. Mormons will have confirmation bias. It's just a condition of the human experience. We tend to view things in a light most favorable to ourselves. Politically, we have this as well. So how do you recognize this? The first thing I think to do is to recognize it, to recognize that, yes, you and me, every single person has confirmation bias. And recognizing it is a huge part of the battle, because once you recognize it, you can begin to ask yourself questions. Do I think this is really true? Or am I hoping that it's true, regardless of the robustness of the evidence, or regardless of where the evidence might actually point to? We have to be careful for this. So I think the 90% of the battle to addressing confirmation bias is to ask yourself why you find a particular argument or a particular piece of evidence compelling. Why is it compelling? And then do this very, very difficult thing. And I can tell you, as an attorney, we were trained to do this. The best attorneys, the best law schools, for example, don't just teach you the law. In fact, they hardly ever teach you the law. They teach you how to think like a lawyer. And the best law firms and I had some great mentors as a lawyer, they teach you, learn the counter arguments, the best version of the counter arguments to your position, so that you can know whether or not your position is actually good, whether it's strong, and whether or not you're in for some serious trouble when you bring your case to the jury, and how you can advise your client. Because if you've got a bad case, no matter how charismatic you are, chances are you're not going to win that case. And so you have to talk to your client about, look, these are the weaknesses of our case. Trying to understand the other side of something. If you get a piece of evidence, let's say it's on the resurrection of Jesus, and let's say it's the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus. You're trying to say, can I actually historically have confidence that Jesus died by crucifixion? And then you begin to look at the historical evidence for it, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, contemporaneous with the time of Jesus, within the 1st or 2nd century, where you have this history by non-Christians, whether it's the Romans or Jewish writers like Josephus and others, about the crucifixion. Do I look at that evidence and say, okay, what would a skeptic say in response to this, and try to think of the best possible argument if you were a skeptic? Maybe you are a skeptic, by the way, and say, what's the best possible evidence to confront this? How would I try to debunk this piece of evidence? That's a great way to determine whether or not you have confirmation bias. Or ask a friend and try to deal with it that way. If you're a skeptic, by the way, do the same thing. Christians might say, well, Jesus was crucified. It was clear that he was crucified. Okay, so you might say, well, maybe he was crucified, maybe he wasn't, maybe he didn't even exist, whatever it is. You look at the evidence and say, okay, if I were a Christian, or if I was looking at this as a historian, how would I look at this evidence and say, this establishes with a high degree of confidence that Jesus existed and was crucified? How would I come to that conclusion? That's a way to address and combat your own confirmation bias, historically speaking. But the fundamental and most important way you can do it is to look into your own heart. That is probably the best and most fundamental way to do it. Sam Mast says that's a good question. as well. So his question is, but our society, they don't want to offend anyone. They change it. So then what do I do in terms of, well, hold on a second. Let me get the whole thing. I'm novice at this. Derek is usually the better one at this.
Abdu, you want to go to the top there? So
yeah. So Sam
go
says,
up to where she says, she says, my question is, how can I find the truth, especially in history, when everything is being censored?
Okay, great question. And so I think one of the things you have to do is, Sam, great question. And I think it's very, very difficult to sort of parse through now with the flood of information and misinformation. It can be very, very difficult, or it can seem that way, but it ought not to be daunting. First, I think what you have to do is look at as many sources as you can on a given subject. So let's say you're looking at the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. What I would encourage you to do is to take as a look at the information from Christian perspectives and from non-Christian perspectives and say, okay, what is this really? Where is the nub of the controversy? What is the nub of the controversy here? Because oftentimes you'll see a lot of people actually agree on a whole lot of things, and you'd be surprised to know how much that is. I would try to find as credible a source as you possibly can, people who are scholars in that area. Now, they don't need to be. I'm not a PhD in history, but I can tell you I've looked into the history and I've consulted with a bunch of different PhDs, both in personal conversation, but also looking at their work and trying to assess it, have debated people on this stuff as well. So I've tried to find the other side of the argument as well. And so I look at Christian sources and non-Christian sources and scholars who review this stuff and say, okay, they tend to orbit around certain experts in the field. So if you read Dr. Bart Ehrman on the resurrection, or you read Gary Habermas on the resurrection, or other folks as well, Mike Licona and Dale Allison and various people, the McGrews, Tim McGrew and Lydia McGrew, on the evidence for the resurrection, what you're going to see is that they tend to orbit around certain experts within the field, Richard Bauckham and others. They tend to orbit around certain experts and certain issues and controversies and facts. And they'll bring a lot of information to the table. So, for example, Dr. Habermas is a fan of what's called the minimal facts approach. He'll look at the facts that almost everyone agrees upon as historically accurate, both Christian and non-Christian, and say, what kind of a case can you build from the minimally agreed upon facts about the historical Jesus, and say, can we build a case for the resurrection from there? There's other folks, Jonathan McClatchy, Tim McGrew, Lydia McGrew, who would take it from what's called a maximal data approach. And they'll grant the minimal facts, at least some of them, but they'll actually add a lot more data and say there's a lot more data here as well. And so what you'll do is you'll take a look and say, what are the best responses to that? You know, when a Christian says, here's a huge amount of data that supports the resurrection of Jesus, what do the skeptics say? And are they starting to quote the same sources? And are they trying to look at the same historical data? And then what you'll see is that there's sort of a consensus that builds not on the correctness of the data, but upon where the data actually should be looked for. And that'll help, because that'll help to combat a view towards looking at sort of popular level only apologists, but also skeptics of the Christian faith, because there's plenty of people who say a lot of stuff that's misinformation, and we all make mistakes. I've made mistakes, and others have made mistakes. Skeptics have made mistakes as well. So the search isn't just go find a video and find that one video or that one article or that one thing you read to be so compelling. Look and see what's in the footnotes. If you're reading a book, does the book have actual documented footnotes? Are they citing scholars? Are they looking at the interpretations of primary sources? If you look at a video on YouTube or whatever it might be, is there research to back this up? And then go and look for the claims. So it takes a little more work. It just does. To know the historical truths or scientific truths takes more work than we might like. But the fact of the matter is, this is a high stakes game. which means we can't just be flip about it. We have to go after the truth um, with vigor and with rigor. Does that mean that it's going to be impossible to find and you need to have a PhD level understanding of research to do it? Absolutely not. There's plenty of great material out there, but you sift through a lot of the stuff that's out there by finding what are people really interacting with? What are the most persuasive people really talking about, and where, because that'll whittle down a whole lot of stuff. Is that easy to say? It wasn't even easy to say. Uh, but is it hard to do? Yeah, it is hard to do. But is it impossible? Absolutely not. And is it worth your time? I would say 100% absolutely. So even while you try to wade through the things, take heart. You'll quickly find, if you're paying attention, you'll quickly find where the best sources actually are and where the debate really lies. And I think you'll come to a knowledge of the truth. I often say it, by the way, and give you a personal example. It took me 9 years to become a believer, not because the truth was hard to find, but because the truth was hard to embrace, because of the consequences of it. I found sufficient answers to become a Christian within about 2 years. I haven't found all the answers. I still haven't found all the answers, but I found sufficient answers that were put to the test within 2 years. And then I put those things to the test because I did not want them to be true for the next 7. But it's out there, Sam. So take heart and go for it. It's great stuff. If you find the truth, you'll be blessed, because the rigor with which you've applied it will shore up the foundation, the solidity, the profundity of the answers you find. So keep going for it. Let's see here. Another question. What are some objective Christian truths we can use to respond to Christians who support the LGBT community? And that's from Sanabu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It may be a horrible misstatement or mispronunciation of your name, but let me try to address it, Sanabu. And you go on to say, actually, oh no, that's your question. There you have it. What are some objective Christian truths we can use to respond to Christians who support the LGBT community? Well, the first thing you have to do in terms of understanding if it's a Christian, this is a great question. The way you've worded it is so great, because if it's a Christian, what you're actually hopefully have a sense of is that the Bible is a source of objective truth. Now, I say that with a little bit of reticence, because just because someone says Christian doesn't mean that they hold scripture in the same way you do. They might not be an inerrantist. They might not feel that this book, that the Bible, is an inerrant book. They might say that, yep, it's got some good guidance, some good teachings, but it's got errors in it, either copyist errors or because human beings were involved in the understanding of Revelation, that they botched it somehow. I don't hold that view, but some do. So you have to ask, what do they mean by that? What do they mean by being a Christian? And what do they think of the Bible? Because if they hold the Bible to be the inerrant, inspired word of God, well, then you can go right to the Bible and say, okay, what does the Bible say about how sexual expression is supposed to be, or how sexuality is supposed to be expressed? And I think it's quite clear from the Bible that it's supposed to be expressed within the bonds of marriage between one man and one woman. So I think that's what it says. And so we have to wrestle with what the Bible says. And if someone says, well, I interpret it differently, you have to ask them, what rules are you using to interpret the Bible that way? Because it can't be what I call, it seems to me, theology. And what do I mean by that? I think that people oftentimes, and I'm certainly guilty of this, and I have been guilty of this in the past, so I have to watch it. And this goes back to the confirmation bias that we started the show off with. When we look at scripture passages and we don't like what they happen to say because maybe someone we know and love is a lesbian or gay or bisexual or whatever it might be, we want to affirm them, and we're looking for any interpretation of the Bible that might help us in affirming them. So we look at a passage and say, okay, I'm going to try to reinterpret this in terms of my new sensibilities or my evolved sensibilities. Then what I think we would do then is say, am I doing that because I wanted to say this, or am I doing it because it act or do I believe what it's saying because it says what it really says? In other words, objectively, you pull it out. There's a difference between what's called exegesis, which means you pull out of the scripture what it actually says, and a thing called eisegesis, which is that you shove into the text things you want it to say. So we have to ask ourselves, are we believing what it says because it says it on its plain face, or it says it in the context and it's obvious what it means, or are we reinterpreting it because of what we want? So the Bible can be a source of that truth with Christians who um, uh, uh, identify or support the LGBT community. Now, the other part of it is this, okay? And I want to say this as quickly as I can because I don't want to spend, I don't want to overstate the matter too much. But pardon me. Um, when we say Christians who support the LGBT community, what does it mean by support? Does that mean that they have someone in their life that they actually love and they care about and they're trying to show compassion to them? And we have to be careful because just because someone doesn't constantly say you're living a sinful lifestyle or you're doing something terrible or whatever, doesn't mean that they're supporting their choices and their behaviors. They might just be loving that person and they're trying to be a good, effective witness in that way. If by support they mean affirming and saying that the Bible or Christianity ought to affirm that, that's a different story. And we have to say, okay, what is the measure of how we come to view sexual morality? Is it based on our preferences and our feelings, or is it based on God's word? And if you think about it, if God is the source of all of existence, then he's the source as he is in his very nature, the source of all morality. Then then morality then the dictates of Scripture, I should say, as expressions of morality are objectively true because he is the objective source of all of reality. And so if he says this is the way sexuality ought to be expressed, that's objectively true because he is the objective source of all of reality as the necessary being. The other thing I would say is that when there's other things, look at the science, you can look at social sciences to see what happens within an LGBT community, what effects there might be, and these kind of things. But you always have to proceed with compassion, understanding with someone as well. But I think, to wrap this up, is that it's not just enough, I think, when you're trying to reach someone to tell them what the Bible says, properly interpreted. I think that, as I said before, that's not really a matter of dispute. I think the important thing, Sanabu, is that you have to tell them not only what the Bible says, but why the Bible says it. And here's a fundamental principle I think that's important. The Bible doesn't place restrictions on the expression of sexuality within the bonds of marriage between one man and one woman, simply because dusty old men in a dusty old book thought that certain behavior was icky and they wanted to use God as a way to give authority to their views on that. No. What the Bible is saying, what God is saying through the Bible is not, I don't want you to do this behavior arbitrarily. No, the Bible is not prohibiting certain conduct only. It's actually protecting something that is sacred. And you start with this. Every human being, regardless of what they say, think, do, or believe, is made in God's image. And therefore, they are inherently and objectively sacred because this objective source of all reality, God himself, claims and says that we bear his image. That makes us sacred no matter what anybody else says, thinks, or does, including ourselves. So we, as human beings, are each sacred. Sex is the process by which human beings come about. If human beings are a sacred product, then the process by which the product comes about, human beings, is itself sacred. And if it becomes the kind of thing that's incredibly malleable, can be whatever you prefer or whatever your predilections might be that it should be, then it loses its sacredness. It loses its sense of preciousness because it becomes malleable to the person. And that seems to broaden the category so much that it almost loses all force and meaning and preciousness. So I think we have to start with that every human being, those who are in the LGBT community and those who are not, are inherently sacred because God says so. The expression of sexuality has to be a function of that sacredness. And sex, I'm not saying that people who can't have kids can't have sex. I'm not saying that. But sex is the activity by which human beings come into being. And that makes it a sacred process because the product is sacred. There's a lot more that can be said about that, but I think that's a good starting point. So if you can show the objectivity of God's existence, and I think you can, and I have episodes of All Rise that talk about the necessity of God's existence. And if he says it in the Bible, this is how sexuality should be, then the objective source of all of existence gives us the objective measure for what sexuality should be in terms of expression. There you have two things that go hand in hand. Thanks for the excellent question. So let's see. So Tim asked a question, and he asked this through Facebook. I had asked out there, I'd asked people to respond to a post I had with some questions. And Tim Ryder's question was, how can we have true free will, but God can do things like harden the hearts of men? For example, with Pharaoh, Ramesses in Genesis, when there's it's actually in the Exodus, where I think that's what you meant, Tim, where the people of Israel are actually not the people of Israel yet, because there is no Israel yet. The Hebrews are enslaved by the Egyptian pharaohs, and you see a story where Pharaoh's heart is hardened against letting the people go, letting the Hebrews go, over and over again, and it seems to suggest that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Well, there's a couple of things here that I would actually respond to on this. This is, by the way, an excellent question. An excellent question. It may be the last question I'm able to get to because it's such an important one, and it requires some unpacking. So follow me here on this, okay? Thanks, Tim, for the question. Pharaoh has his own free will. However, what you see in the story of the Exodus, where the Hebrews are enslaved, Moses comes and tells Pharaoh, God says, the God of all the universe, not just a God, because the Egyptians believed in many gods. And in fact, Pharaoh believed that he was the morning and the evening star. He was a God on earth, a God incarnate. Moses challenges that and says, no, the true God of the universe, the God of these slaves who you think are so lowly, he commands you let them go. And Pharaoh's heart is hardened by this command. God knows that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened by this command. And Pharaoh says, no, I will not let your people go. So God brings 10 plagues. And each time the plagues happen, with every plague, Pharaoh relents and says, I'll let your people go. And then the plague is lifted. And then God hardens Pharaoh's heart, as it were. I think a proper way to look at this in light of human free will, and other examples in the Bible, people do in fact have free will, is that God has two kinds of wills himself. He has what's called his directive will, where he makes things happen. And then he has his permissive will, where he allows things to happen. And he allows things to happen that he knows will happen under certain circumstances. So follow me on this. God knows that when he relents from the plague that's affecting Egypt, Pharaoh will get hard in his heart because, and this is a little bit of speculation, but because he is just incensed that this God of the Hebrews is actually the real God, that he has power over Pharaoh. So in the middle of the pain of the plague, Pharaoh is like, we can't take it anymore. Okay, fine, let the people go. and then the plague lifts, and the people of Egypt start to recover, and the empire starts to recover. And then he's like, okay, no, I just hate the fact that this God seems to be a God over me, and we're recovering now, and so I'm going to harden my heart and say, no, I will not let them go. So interestingly, it's God's mercy that hardens Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh is hardened in his heart because he doesn't like the fact that the God of the Hebrews is the God of the universe, and he's not, and that his gods are not powerful. And so that causes Pharaoh to have his heart hardened. God knows that's going to happen. So God is sovereign. God can make things happen, or God can allow things to happen. And so one might call this middle knowledge or Molinism, where God knows what will happen and God knows what would happen under certain circumstances. So God knows that given these circumstances, Pharaoh will freely choose to resist and harden his heart. So God allows those circumstances to happen so that Pharaoh will freely harden his own heart. So in that sense, God hardens Pharaoh's heart because he allows circumstances to happen that will allow Pharaoh to freely harden his own heart. So in that sense, God allows it and causes the circumstances to happen so that Pharaoh will freely choose to harden his own heart. Now, I've given an example, and I've gotten this from someone else, but here's how I think divine foreknowledge and even God's sovereignty can interact with human free will. Let's say, you and I are roommates in college, okay? And you're training for a running event, a marathon, or maybe you're a college athlete and you're really trying to cut weight. Let's say you're a wrestler and you're trying to cut weight. But I also happen to know that you have a tremendous, almost irresistible sweet tooth. And I went out to dinner the day before and I got one of those monstrous chocolate cakes, those like 19,000 layer chocolate cakes that look like Everest on a plate. And I bring it home, and it's sitting there in the refrigerator, nice and cool and almost irresistible. Now I'm sitting there watching television, and you come home from the gym, from practice, whatever it is, and you have worked really hard, and you do not want to ruin the progress you've made to cut weight for the meet that's coming up or for the match that's coming up. But you know that piece of chocolate cake is sitting there and you want it so bad, and you pace the floor after you get back. You're going to take your shower and think, okay, I'm just going to go to bed, or I could eat the cake, or I'm going to go to bed, or I could eat the cake. And I'm sitting there watching television, and I'm watching you deliberate back and forth whether you should eat it or not. And you finally exercise your willpower and you take your shower and you go to bed and you don't eat it. You sort of kept your wits about you in that moment and resisted the almost irresistible. You did that of your own free will, right? Little did you know, I threw the cake away. It's already gone. So in my sovereignty, as someone who knows something you don't know, I removed the cake from the equation. So you couldn't have chosen the cake. Sorry, that's not true. You couldn't have eaten the cake even if you chose to do it. But does that mean you didn't freely choose to resist the cake? No, because you actually freely chose to resist the cake because you thought you could eat it. And so you freely chose not to. But I removed the cake. So even if you had chosen to eat it, it wouldn't have been possible. So in my sovereignty in that situation, I prevented you from doing something that you could have freely chosen to do. But in your sovereignty, in terms of your own free will, you freely chose not to do it. I think that there's instances where God can act in the world in a way that allows circumstances to play themselves out to where we can exercise our free will, but in a way that actually works God's will out in the universe and in history. So we still have free will, and God is sovereign. How that plays out in each circumstance or situation, how it plays out in salvation and all these things, I'm not necessarily going to answer right now, but I think that is hopefully a start for trying to understand what amounts to an incredibly important question. Thanks so much, Tim, for a great question. Let's see. It's a good question to sort of wrap up the day with. Is that at the top? Let's see. uh, oh, a guy who goes by the name of False Doctrines Exposed, that's an ominous name, says that he enjoys the pre-recorded football game story. The game is over, but that doesn't mess with the free will of the players you're about to watch. Yeah, that's true. But let's back up to the analogy and say, okay, so the players actually interacted and did it, but you're watching a game um, that the outcome's already been determined and you're just watching it. You don't know what's going to happen, but it's already been determined. Now, that's true of the watcher. The watcher doesn't know what's going to happen, and the watcher might react of their own free will with a disappointment or jubilation or whatever it is. And that's true because the events have already happened. But now let's put it into the players. The players, the game wasn't pre-recorded before they played, but it is foreknown ahead of time. God can know things ahead of time without actually causing those things ahead of time. One of the things that I often think of is the birth of my own children. Um, unless the Lord comes back, the reality is the death rate is 1 per person. It happens 100% of the time with everybody, except for this one guy. A couple of thousand years ago, Jesus died and didn't stay dead. In fact, he perpetually lives now. But absent the Lord returning, my children are going to die. I knew that. My wife and I knew that when we decided to try to have children. And then we definitely knew that when they were born. Just because I foreknow that my kids are going to die doesn't mean that I'm morally responsible or in any sense of the word a cause agent in terms of a proximate cause of their deaths. Just because I know it's going to happen doesn't mean that I actually cause it. I know they're going to have heartbreak in their life. I know they're going to have skinned knees. I know that they're going to have disappointments. Do I cause those things just because I know they're going to happen? Well, no. So God knows with perfect knowledge what's going to happen, but he doesn't necessarily cause bad things, even though, like I said before, he can allow bad things to happen. I don't know your name, but you go by the handle on YouTube, Clausewitz42. What biblical text tells us that of human free will? So, the Bible does say, "Whoever so wills may come," and so God allows there to be instances where people can choose to come to faith in Him. But of course, the Bible also says that no man comes to the Father, but he first draw him. So there's obviously a sense in which we come to the Father, and whosoever shall believe in him suggests that this is a volitional act. But then the Bible also says that no one comes to the Father, but he first draw him. In fact, you look at the sermon that Peter gives in Acts chapter 2. Peter, at the day of Pentecost, basically gives this lengthy sermon. And this goes to, Sam, your question too about where in the Bible do we come up with the idea of free will. You're not going to get necessarily a philosophical dissertation on the existence of human free will in terms of here's how free will works, this is what it's defined as, and this is how it's expressed. But what you see is that people do things of their own volition. In fact, I think that's the case with Adam and Eve. When they the very first action that results in the fall of humanity is they listen to the serpent and they imbibe of the fruit they should not be eating, and they did that of their own free will, as it were. There's no indication that it wasn't of their free will. So I think that you have every reason to believe in those instances that when people act and God judges them for the morality of their actions, that they do so of their own free will. But there is this element of God's sovereignty as well. But back to Acts chapter 2. So Peter, in the day of Pentecost, is giving a sermon about what it means to be saved. And like a good Jewish boy, he goes through a history of tradition, because that's what they do. And so he goes back and says, from the times of these things and the times of these things, he goes all the way to the Christ. And he says about Jesus, he said, essentially, and I don't have the quote memorized in my head, but look it up in Acts chapter 2. He said essentially that God had foreordained all of these things to happen so that the Christ would come, so that the God the Son would come. But you, he says, with the help of wicked men, put the Son of Man to death or crucified him. So it suggests that this was God's plan all along, But they, or the people who were in charge, the religious leaders and the Romans, conspired essentially of their own free will to put Jesus to death. So yes, it was part of God's sovereign plan, but they willfully and volitionally did it. So you have the interplay of sovereignty and free will. I also think, and if I want to make sure I get the chapter and verse right. I have a whole response to this with regard to one of the parables of Jesus. In, I want to say, Luke chapter 15. It's the parable of the generous employer. I'm going to just say this, and then we'll sign off. So bear with me for a minute, because I got to say, let me just tease you to stick around for me for a minute, because I love the scriptures, because every story, it seems to me, that Jesus tells is almost so deep with truth and applicability, not just to the times it was said, but to our times today, that it almost staggers the imagination. So, you know the parable. The parable goes like this: that there was an employer, a person who owned a vineyard, and he sends his foreman out, or he goes out actually to hire day laborers, people to work in the vineyard. And he goes out in the morning and he sees guys who are lined up there who want to work for the day. And day laborers existed back then, 2,000 years ago, and they exist today. You go to a Home Depot or a Lowe's, and you'll see drywallers and rough carpenters and plumbers or whatever who want to get work for the day. And they get that work by just being hired by the day when a contractor walks out or walks up to the parking lot. Well, it happened back then too. So he goes and he wants to hire some folks to work in his vineyard, and he selects some guys and say, okay, you can come work for me. They negotiate back and forth for the wage, and they come up with $1, essentially one denarius for the day's wage, and that's a fair wage. And they say, okay, we'll take that. We'll go work in your field. And so he sends them off to work in his field in the morning so they can work all day in the field. Well, the master of the vineyard goes back again and sees guys who are still waiting there for work, which, by the way, is interesting, because they wouldn't wait there. Because typically you would hire everybody you wanted to hire in the morning. And if you didn't get hired in the first round, the chances of you getting hired later are extremely slim. So you try to find some other kind of work, or you'd go home in shame because you weren't able to provide for your family. But the master of the vineyard goes out, the owner of the vineyard goes out and sees that there's still guys waiting there for work much later, after those first guys got hired. And he says, okay, would you want to work for me? Sure, absolutely. He says, okay, I'll give you a denarius for your day's labor. So they go and work in the vineyard. Then he goes back a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time, to the point where there's only 1 hour of work left in the day. Okay, this is the parable Jesus is giving of God. God is the owner of the vineyard in this parable. So he says, okay, you guys who've been waiting here all day, why have you been waiting here all day? And they're like, well, we're hoping someone will give us work. And he says, okay, go to my vineyard and work in the field for only an hour. It's only 1 hour left of work in the day, and I'll pay you a denarius, the same amount of money the first guys who worked all day in the field were getting. So the end of the day comes, and the master of the vineyard tells the foreman to pay all the men. And he makes sure that the last guys, the guys who only worked for 1 hour, get paid first, so that everybody else will see it. So they get paid their denarius. And the first guys, who are also going to get paid a denarius, who've been there all day, they say, that's not fair. You owe us more money. We've been working all day. These guys worked for an hour. You owe us more money. What is the response? Now, what's interesting to me here is this. I come from an Eastern culture, Middle Eastern culture, which is an honor and shame culture. And Jesus was telling this parable in an honor and shame culture. And so what you see going on here is not unfairness. No, what you see is that Jesus is saying that God rewards people who hold out hope that though they haven't worked all day and earned enough, that they're hoping that someone will come and prevent them from feeling shame, maybe the shame of their sin or whatever it is. And so he rewards these men who waited around all day in hope, in faith that someone would honor them with work. and he credits their faith as if it was work. And that harkens all the way back to Abraham, who believed God, as Paul says, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So faith is credited as if it was work. And this parable harkens all the way back to Abraham. And every Jew hearing Jesus' voice would have understood that and seen that this is a parallel to Abraham. God rescues us from our shame by honoring us if we have faith that he can do so, not because of our works, but because of his righteousness. So that's the first part. This speaks to an honor and shame thing, but it also speaks to human free will and God's sovereignty. Because remember, the first guys are upset now because they didn't get paid what they thought they were due because they worked the whole day, and the guys who worked an hour got paid a denarius. Jesus says, the master of the vineyard says to those guys who say, you owe me more money. He says, wait a minute, friend. Can't I do with my money what I want? That's God's sovereignty. And didn't you agree to a denarius? That's human free will. So you see in this one parable, Jesus tells us what grace is like and God's sovereign grace. But he also tells us about human free will, and God respects our free wills as well. And so there's so much depth to this parable, and I didn't even scratch the surface of it. But in this one parable, you can see God's sovereignty and human free will acting in a dance with each other. God is sovereign, ultimately sovereign. And everyone, I think, hopefully you'll hear that from me. But he does, in fact, allow us to have our free will as well. Guys, there's so much more I could talk about. And you guys are talking amongst yourselves. By the way, it seems to me in the chats, which is great. So hopefully that's helpful, guys. I really enjoyed this time. I do miss my buddy Derek. I have had my buddy Lance over there in the producer's chair, in the captain's chair. He's the guy in the chair. If you're a fan of Marvel movies, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, right.
So thanks, Lance, for your work there. You know, Lance, it occurs to me, I don't thank you enough. Certainly not. I know you're not looking for this, but certainly not publicly. You and your wife, Carol, for all you do to make this kind of a broadcast and a podcast possible. Thanks again for your hard work as a producer for the ministry, and for this particular live episode, but all the episodes that we record here. Friends, that's going to wrap up Deliberations. If you're watching on social media, you can find out about us as well by going to our YouTube page, youtube.com/AbduMurrayOfficial. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell. If you subscribe and don't click the bell, I don't think you're going to get notified when we go live, but you'll get a notification. Hey, we're going live, and you can join us. On social media, if you follow us, you'll get a notification that we're going live as well. So join us for Deliberations. Make sure to share this podcast or this YouTube show with your friends. We'd love to have as many non-Christians as possible interact with us. And be sure to tune in every other Monday for not our Deliberations. Tune in every other Monday for All Rise, which is our podcast where we take a look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective, using my background as a lawyer. And then also tune in for Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda, which appear every Thursday, where a world-class speaker, someone who's an evangelist and an apologist, joins me, and where we discuss times where we blew it and we didn't do it right, or we could have done it better, or could have done it differently. And we share our mistakes, not only to humanize ourselves, but also so that you can learn from the foibles that we've had, so that you'll have greater confidence to go out and say, you know what, no matter what mistakes I make, the Holy Spirit can make none. And so we rely on him. Again, friends, this has been Deliberations. Thanks again, Lance. Thanks again to all of you. Thanks for tuning in. It's been an engaging conversation. Hopefully, you've gotten something out of it. I certainly have. And I look forward to the next time when we chat live, and catch us next time on All Rise as well. Until then, friends, defense rests.